There are bad bosses out there. But what's not talked about as much is there's also good bosses. And so what we sought out to do is find out whether you could measure the productivity of individual employees and see if productivity really rose for individual employees if they happen to be working with a good boss. And so what we did is gather data on workers' productivity and find, wow, there's a big effect from a good boss relative to a bad boss. What we got access to was data on what we call technology-based service workers who have their performance timed. And that enables us to measure their productivity. So that's the foundation of the study, is productivity. And then given their productivity, which would be really how many customers they treat an hour would be an example of productivity, you can then see if people with good bosses treat more customers per hour than people with bad bosses. And what we find is that there's an enormous range of productivity based on who your boss is. And that is, if you're working on your job and you change to someone who has a history of being a good boss, your productivity definitely goes up. The original data set we used had data on productivity, and so that's how we identified whether bosses matter, is linking it to productivity. A data set like this doesn't really have the traits of the boss. So in order to look at the traits of what makes a good boss, we needed to do a case study. And so we did a case study on the Royal Bank of Canada. So they have an enormous workforce. It's the biggest bank in Canada, and they have a lot of data. And so we looked to them to see what the traits of a good boss appear to be. And there's a sequence in order to identify the traits of a good boss. So to identify the traits of a good boss, first you have to tell, again, whether bosses matter. And so what we show is that workers are more engaged in their workplace and are more productive when they have a good boss, in this case. And so you really see that in what's called engagement data, which is data that asks, do you feel motivated on your job? Do you identify with your company? And sure enough, those people who are motivated and identify with their company are higher performers. And then, given that they're high performers, we look to see, well, what are their bosses doing differently? The first thing they do is they set the vision. So what's the vision for this company, and how do you personally fit into that vision? That's what they do for their subordinates. The next thing they do is they drive results. So they make sure the teams and the individuals are productive and feeling that they're contributing. And so this they would do by a lot of teaching and training of their subordinates, a lot of motivating, those sorts of things. The next thing they do is they really manage day-to-day workflow to make sure that the workflow that you're getting is commensurate with what it is you're doing. The last thing is they manage career goals. So it turns out that what is incredibly motivating to an individual is for them to have a vision for where their career is going to go. And so a good boss will share that vision with them, will give them guidance in where they're going, and give them good feedback to help them along the path. So most workers are not stagnant, but they have other aspirations. They want to move on, or they just want to do their day-to-day job well and have that fit into their career. And a good boss will help them do that. What Google did is a couple of years ago, they started a project called Project Oxygen. And what Google was finding was that people didn't like their bosses. They didn't think they were useful, and there was even a sense that they should have no bosses within Google. But they found out as they cut back in the number of bosses, people just went to leaders for routine tasks, and it was a burden on leaders. They found they really needed low-level managers. But they needed to find out, well, what makes a good manager? And Google is interesting because they have so much data. So they have data on workers' performance. They have data on the traits of bosses because they do these evaluations constantly. They're a data intense company. And then they look to identify people who manage them and what their traits are. And the traits are really aligned with the traits I discussed at RBC, in that they're traits that are you pay attention to your employees, you give them a vision, you motivate them, and you set out career goals for them. So even though we think of Google as being engineers who are kind of self-directed and want to work alone and not be subject to the supervision of a boss, when a boss can help them with their career goals, they're quite happy to work with a good boss. After you leave a good boss, does the effect of that good boss linger on your performance? So you can imagine that if you have a good boss and they train you how to do your job well, that you're going to be productive even as you get switched to a lower level boss. And we did find that that happens, that people's productivity lingers. And therefore, our conclusion is that in that study, we could see that one trait of a boss seems to be teaching, because you've learned something that you carry with you with the rest of your career. And so that teaching could be how to do your job, or it could be something like, how to be motivated surrounding your career goals. But in some way or another, a good boss is teaching something that lingers. And so that's what we were able to show in that study.